Homeowners associations, commonly known as HOAs, are often advertised as organizations that keep neighborhoods clean, orderly, and valuable. They enforce rules, collect dues, and manage shared spaces. At least, that is how they are supposed to work. But when rules are enforced without empathy, discretion, or basic humanity, HOAs can quickly turn into something much darker. Today's story is about a woman who had already lost everything that mattered most to her. She was not breaking rules out of defiance. She was not trying to challenge authority. She was simply grieving. Instead of compassion, she received fines. Instead of understanding, she received threats. And instead of help, she received daily punishment for a car that represented the last piece of her late husband. This is the story of Margaret Wilson, and how an HOA's obsession with enforcement exposed a system completely detached from human reality. Margaret Wilson was 70 years old when her life changed forever. She and her husband Robert had lived in their home at Oak Palms Estates for just over 22 years. They moved there in the early 2000s, back when the neighborhood was new and quiet. Robert worked as a mechanic for most of his life. Even after retirement, he never stopped fixing things. Their garage was filled with tools. Wrenches hung neatly on the wall. Oil stains marked the concrete floor like memories frozen in time. Robert's favorite possession was his old blue 1998 Ford pickup truck. It wasn't worth much money, but it carried decades of stories. He used it to help neighbors move furniture, to drive Margaret to doctor's appointments, to haul supplies when someone in the neighborhood needed help. Then, one afternoon, Robert collapsed in the driveway. Margaret watched paramedics try to revive him next to that same truck. They couldn't. From that day forward, the truck never moved again. After the funeral, people slowly stopped visiting. The house became quiet. Margaret found herself staring out the front window every morning, looking at the truck. To anyone else, it was just an old vehicle. To her, it was the last physical reminder of her husband. She wasn't ready to sell it. She wasn't ready to donate it. She wasn't ready to let it go. And no one told her she had to. The HOA rules mentioned inoperable vehicles, but they did not define grief. They did not explain how long a widow should be allowed to mourn. Months passed. Margaret barely left the house except for groceries and church. The truck remained exactly where Robert had parked it. No one complained, or so she thought. On a hot Monday morning, Margaret opened her front door and froze. A bright orange notice was taped to the center of the door. She had never received one before. The words were short, cold, official, HOA violation, inoperable vehicle. Her hands shook as she read it again. It gave her 7 days to remove the truck or face enforcement action. No explanation, no signature, no acknowledgement of her loss. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table and cried. After calming herself, she decided to call the HOA office. She explained everything slowly. She told them her husband had died. She told them the truck belonged to him. She told them she just needed time. The woman on the phone paused. Then she said, "I understand, but the board does not make exceptions." Margaret asked for more time. The answer was no. A week passed. Margaret's heart sank when another letter arrived. This one was different. Cold. Menacing. HOA fine, $50 per day beginning today. She stared at the paper for what felt like hours. $50 a day might be small for some, but for Margaret, it was overwhelming. She lived on a fixed income, her husband's small pension, her Social Security, and a few savings. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't expected to be harassed for her grief. The letter stated clearly, payment due immediately. Failure to pay would accrue additional fines. Legal action could follow. Margaret called the HOA office again. "I'm just trying to grieve," she said softly. "I will move the truck eventually. Please, can you give me some time?" The person on the other end replied in a robotic tone. "Rules are rules. We cannot make exceptions." She hung up. Tears welled up again. The weight of the fines settled on her chest like a heavy stone. By the end of the second week, the fines had already reached $700. Each morning, another letter arrived, like a ticking clock counting her grief. Margaret began to notice a pattern. Across the street, Mr. Henderson's car sat with a flat tire for months. 2 houses down, a broken-down SUV had been parked on the driveway for almost a year. No letters. No fines. Nothing. Margaret started taking notes. She photographed every car. She documented the broken fences, peeling paint, and overgrown lawns that the HOA ignored. Then she sent an email to the board, politely explaining her situation. She asked for a hardship exemption due to her recent loss. No reply. The fines continued. They were now $50 per day, every single day, with late fees stacking. By the end of the month, Margaret owed over $1,500, money she didn't have. The letters became increasingly threatening, using phrases like, "Immediate action required. Legal remedies will be pursued. Lien will be placed on your property." Margaret felt trapped. She couldn't leave the house. She couldn't sell the truck. She couldn't afford to pay. Margaret decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. It was held in the small community clubhouse, a room with pale beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and folding chairs lined against the walls. She wore black, the same dress she had worn to her husband's funeral. Her hands shook as she clutched the stack of letters she had received. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath. She explained everything. Her husband's death, her grief, her financial limitations, her love for the truck and what it represented. She begged the board to consider compassion, to recognize that the truck was more than metal and paint. It was a memory. The board president, Mr. Clark, leaned back in his chair. He adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. "We sympathize with your loss, Mrs. Wilson," he said slowly. "However, granting exceptions sets a dangerous precedent for the community." Margaret's voice trembled as she responded, "This is not about precedent. This is about humanity." The board remained unmoved. She left the meeting feeling defeated, humiliated, and more alone than ever. Outside, neighbors whispered. Some were sympathetic, others fearful of challenging the board. No one knew that this moment, this single meeting, was the start of a conflict that would soon reach national attention. One morning, Margaret woke to the loud rumble of a tow truck engine outside her window. She looked out and froze. The blue 1998 Ford pickup, her last connection to Robert, was being hooked up. Her hands shook. She ran to the door, but it was too late. The driver gave her a polite nod and said, "Board ordered it removed." No warning. No chance to speak. No compromise. She collapsed onto the couch, crying silently. The HOA later sent an invoice for $1,200, towing and storage fees. Margaret called the HOA office immediately. She pleaded, begged, explained that this truck was her husband's memory. The reply was chilling. "Fines will continue until all violations are resolved. Rules are rules." Now, Margaret was being fined for a truck she no longer had. Her grief turned into anger, despair, and fear, all at once. The letters kept coming. Every day, $50, $50, $50. Even with the truck gone, the fines were accumulating. By the end of the second month, the total had reached over $3,000. Margaret started ignoring calls. She stopped answering her door. Even mail became a source of anxiety. Neighbors began noticing her withdrawal. Some whispered that the board had gone too far. One neighbor, Daniel Reyes, a retired journalist, finally stepped forward. He knocked on her door and said, "Margaret, you don't have to go through this alone. Let me help." She hesitated. She didn't trust anyone, but the exhaustion in her body made her nod. Daniel began attending HOA meetings, silently recording everything. The letters escalated in tone. Final notice: lien will be placed on property. Failure to comply will result in foreclosure. Margaret couldn't understand how anyone could be so relentless. She was alone, grieving, and financially struggling. She called legal aid organizations. They confirmed what she feared. The HOA was likely violating state law. Yet legal action would take months she didn't feel she had. Meanwhile, the board showed no signs of slowing down. Every day brought more stress, more anxiety, more fear of losing her home. Daniel realized that words alone wouldn't stop the HOA. He brought a small recorder to the next board meeting. Quietly, he captured conversations that would later be pivotal. Board members discussing fines openly, threatening foreclosure, deliberating how to avoid public backlash. After that meeting, Daniel approached Margaret. "You need proof," he said. "People will only believe this if we can show exactly what they said." Margaret felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Someone was finally on her side, and someone was documenting the injustice. After weeks of fines, harassment, and emotional strain, Daniel decided it was time to go public. He called a local TV station, providing copies of all HOA violation letters, photos of Margaret's truck, recordings from the HOA board meetings, documentation of selective enforcement. Within days, a reporter contacted Margaret for an interview. Margaret hesitated. She was afraid of retaliation, of becoming the target of more bullying. But Daniel reminded her, nothing will change if nobody sees the truth. The interview aired on a Tuesday evening. The segment's headline read, HOA fines widow daily for late husband's truck, community outraged. Calls flooded the HOA office. Board members began receiving messages from angry residents and viewers. For the first time, the HOA realized that this was no longer a private matter. The story spread quickly. Social media exploded with reactions. How can an HOA be this cruel? This is elder abuse. They're punishing grief. Local newspapers followed up. Radio stations discussed it. By the end of the week, Margaret's situation had become a statewide headline. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak now came forward. People who had previously ignored HOA rules began sharing their own stories. The board was under unprecedented pressure. Some members tried to justify their actions, claiming rules are rules. Others panicked, realizing the organization could face legal consequences. The HOA issued a short public statement. The board follows community guidelines and enforces rules fairly. We sympathize with the homeowner but cannot make exceptions. No apology. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No mention of Margaret. Internally, the board was fracturing. 3 members wanted to reverse the fines immediately. The president insisted that bending the rules would set a dangerous precedent. Voices were raised. Arguments broke out during private board meetings. Emails leaked to residents. Tension escalated as fear of lawsuits grew. 2 days later, Margaret received a notice from the Arizona Department of Real Estate. An investigation had been opened against the HOA. Allegations included excessive fines, improper towing, violation of due process, possible elder abuse. The board's attorney advised them to stop fines immediately and negotiate a settlement. For the first time, the board seemed afraid. They realized their actions could have serious legal and financial consequences. Margaret, meanwhile, felt a renewed sense of hope. She finally had official support to fight back and protect her home. With public scrutiny and state oversight, the HOA began to back down. All daily fines were suspended. The lien on Margaret's home was lifted. Towing fees were refunded. But there was a condition. The HOA requested she sign a non-disclosure agreement. Margaret refused. She wanted her story to be a lesson, not silenced. She gave one more interview, calmly recounting her experience. Her words resonated far beyond her neighborhood. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for understanding. Compassion should not be optional. For the first time in months, Margaret felt vindicated. The pressure from public scrutiny and state oversight began to fracture the HOA board. During an emergency meeting, residents packed the small clubhouse. Voices rose, and frustration spilled over. 3 board members resigned immediately, citing personal stress and fear of legal consequences. The board president attempted to defend himself, insisting he had only been following the rules, but the residents weren't listening. He was challenged with recordings, emails, and photographs proving selective enforcement and harassment. It became clear that the board president had lost credibility entirely. By the end of the week, the entire board had changed. New leadership promised transparency, compassion, and adherence to state law. Margaret watched quietly from her living room window, realizing that the community she feared had turned into a source of support. The Arizona Department of Real Estate issued a formal report. The fines were excessive and unlawful. The towing of the truck violated state statutes. The lien was improperly placed. Elder abuse regulations had likely been breached. The HOA faced substantial penalties, both financially and reputationally. All fines, liens, and towing fees were fully refunded to Margaret. Additionally, the new board implemented mandatory hardship exemptions for grieving homeowners. For the first time, Margaret felt a sense of justice and relief. Margaret finally agreed to one last interview. She sat in the quiet living room she had shared with Robert for over 30 years. The blue truck had been donated to a veterans charity, one final act of honoring her husband's memory. Her voice was calm, measured, yet emotional. I never wanted revenge. I just wanted to live my life with dignity. This should not happen to anyone else. Her words resonated with the wider audience, sparking discussions about HOA accountability, compassion, and oversight. The residents of Oak Palms Estates were no longer silent. Board elections were open, competitive, and transparent. New rules were implemented. All fines required due process. Hardship exemptions became mandatory. HOA meetings were open to all residents. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak now shared their opinions freely. The community had learned that abuse of power could no longer go unchecked. Daniel Reyes, the retired journalist neighbor, returned to his quiet life, satisfied that the recordings and advocacy had changed the neighborhood forever. Margaret planted a small garden in the front yard, a tribute to Robert and a symbol of new beginnings. The truck, gone but remembered, served as a lesson. Rules are important, but humanity and compassion cannot be optional. Her story became a cautionary tale for HOAs across the country. Residents, boards, and lawmakers alike cited her experience when discussing ethical enforcement and homeowner rights. HOAs exist to protect communities, but when rules are enforced without empathy, lives can be destroyed. Margaret Wilson refused to stay silent. She documented the abuses, she endured the stress, and she ultimately fought back. She didn't just save her home. She held an HOA accountable and reminded an entire system that compassion matters more than compliance. And in doing so, she honored the memory of her late husband, proving that even in grief, strength and resilience can prevail.